I'm a survivor of sexual violence myself, and one of the things that I was most struck by was the absence of voices and faces, the absence of real names. You know, when we talk about sexual violence, we use pseudonyms, we blot out faces, we really encourage a form of invisibility. And I've worked on the issue for a long time, about 20 years. And I remember thinking at one point that if I could get every woman I've ever met in a room to share her story, it would be a powerful and really amazing gathering. And that our collective stories married to our faces and our real identities met a gap in the culture that existed that I think has made the world less safe for all of us and made it less just for victims.
I'm a mother of a survivor of sexual assault, a victim of sexual assault. And it happened a long time ago. It happened in 1990, and it still is with me, and certainly with my daughter, and has influenced part of my work and definitely her career. And even though I did a lot of public speaking, it was always something that had humor, and I could use motivational techniques, and all of a sudden, here I'm speaking about this, which is totally different. I can intellectualize about it without any problem and talk about it and dialogue with people. And every now and then, it enters me, and I find myself guarding against that even now, to not go to that place. And yet, that place is a really big part of me. Well, when I first got the phone call, she was half a country away. And I can remember the very words. She couldn't talk to me. And I said, Anne, you need to talk with me or I can't help you. And she just was kind of moaning softly and crying. She wouldn't talk. And then finally she said the words, Mom, I've been raped. And I remember at that time not feeling much of anything, surprisingly so. You'd think a mother would just fall apart and go to pieces. But I really didn't. And something happened in me. And I don't know exactly what it was, but I was able to talk with her, and she said if I call the police, he said he'd come back and kill me. And I said, he'll do that anyway, and you need to call. And so I hung up that phone, and that was that disconnect. And I had the presence of mind to get through that experience in a calm way, thank God. And then afterward, you know, the reality began to sink in. But at first, nothing. I had no feeling. And this stayed with me a long time, and I never have understood that I wasn't angered, I wasn't anything except almost numb, totally numb to the whole thing. A year later at that trial, I sat as close to the man that raped my daughter as I am to you in the courtroom when I testified, and I had no feeling. I didn't feel rage toward him. I was numb, totally numb. She was fortunate to come out of that experience alive. She had a knife to her throat, to her ribs. And she wasn't sure she was going to make it out alive. And she was able to, and she decided, because he had a weapon, she made the decision not to fight back. I think the biggest shock to me after I'd gone through this experience with my daughter was all the people that I knew came forth to me and said, this happened to me, or this happened to my daughter, or this happened to my mother, or this happened to my sister. And these were people I was with for years, never knew that. One person came to me, and she had 3 children, and grown children. She was divorced, and she told me it had happened to her when she was 18. She never told her family, never told her husband. She said, you know, I might still have my family if I had shared that. In quiet moments now, sometimes it's harder now than it was then, as I look back. I see that at the foot of our bed, we have on the other wall, there's a picture of her when she was maybe a year and a half, and I look at that little curly hair and that pretty little girl, and I think, little did she know that she would have to experience that. And sometimes I have a hard time looking at her picture because of that. it's harder now than it was then, in the middle of all the commotion and of all the support and of all the everything that was happening. Now it seems harder.
Things that I hear from victims, I often hear victims talk about the importance of the first responder, you know, that first person they disclose to. And when that person says, "I'm so sorry," or "tell me how you're doing," how those words resonate. And when instead they hear, "What were you wearing?" or "Why were you out so late?" when you set in motion that model of blaming and shaming, victims are often silenced. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things about the work for me is encountering the stories where victims have been silenced, where that first responder has effectively said, "There's something you did that allowed this to happen, and therefore you have not earned my sympathy." The advice that I would give to police is not unlike what I'd say to any first responder, that they have a colossal amount of psychic and practical power over a survivor, not only over a survivor in terms of her or his emotional health, in needing a compassionate and strong response, but they actually have a terrific influence, I would argue, over whether that survivor even wants to take the case forward. If a police officer responds in a way that's critical, that's disbelieving, that is uncompassionate, those are cues to a survivor that the world she's about to enter into, if she wants to take this case forward, may not be as safe or as just a place as she would wish it to be. And very often, those first responses will dampen a survivor's willingness or enthusiasm to ever take a case forward. What they need to understand is that for this survivor, this is a moment in her or his life that is so painful and so personal and so monumental. It's not another night of work. It's their life. And you can't afford a bad day on this job. And I know that's hard, that's hard to hear. It's hard to say, because I know in my work I have bad days. But when you have someone whose life and their willingness to pursue justice may be, to some degree, hanging in the balance based on your willingness to present a just institutional face, you have a special and really important challenge and responsibility. Prosecutors, in a sense, I always I have a sympathy with prosecutors in that, in a sense, we culturally are not where we need to be, which means we have men and women on juries who represent our broader cultural attitudes or dynamics. And as a culture, we don't understand rape and sexual violence. We don't understand how often it happens. We don't understand that most of these cases do not involve a stranger. And we need to culturally come to terms with those things in order to have just outcomes in courtrooms. But having said that, law leads the culture as much as the culture leads law, which means a bold prosecutor who understands rape and sexual violence, who understands the reality of how victims respond, who actually can make a compelling argument, and those arguments are there to be made. There is a compelling story. There's a public health and public interest story that the community needs to hear about why we need to prosecute these cases and why we need to lock perpetrators up. And there's a story about compassion and justice that I think the culture also is open to. So what I hope that prosecutors see is that there can be a victory for all of us in these cases, but we have to try them first. We have to have the courage to bring them into the courtroom. And even when you lose a case, and no one wants to lose a case like this, if we can use that time and those moments in a court of law to educate those jurors, to educate the judges, to make statements to the public about why these cases matter, we send out a really important message to victims, and we also send out a really important message to communities. So we always, we want those cases tried. I'm always amazed by and struck by the terrific amount of power each of us have in the lives of victims. Whether you know it or not, every single person watching this video today is going to encounter someone who has lived through sexual violence. They may never identify themselves to you, they may never talk about it, but somewhere along the line, someone you know has lived through this, and you will be talking about this issue or thinking through this issue or musing on a case that's in the public eye. And what you say and how you react and the compassion you bring to that discussion is going to have a profound effect on those individuals.
I think it's important for an advocate to say two things. Number one, I believe you, and I'm so sorry.